Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to the ISO 9001 2015, Knowing What to Expect to Ensure a Stress-Free Audit presentation. My name is Joe Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. A couple of notes for our participants today. All of you are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so we do ask that you use the question portion of the dashboard. We'll be looking at questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not this presentation will be made available after we're finished. We do make our presentations available in two key ways. First of all, if you'd like to get a copy of the slides, they will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, we do post our webinars to our YouTube page, and you can find the link for that on our website. Just look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today, we're going to be, first of all, unpacking in kind of a structured way what ISO 9001 is all about and how it is conceived, you might say. So we're going to kind of get into the conceptual aspect of ISO 9001. We're going to talk a little bit about how this presentation was initially put together. And then we're going to unpack some key areas. I'm going to be going through management review, internal audit, and some other areas of key importance and significance during the audit process. I've got a couple of additional items that were new at the time that ISO 9001 2015 was initially published. We'll talk a little bit about the leadership interview. This is a unique item that PJR has as part of its audit process. A couple concluding remarks and then your questions. So let's acknowledge something that is critical in understanding what ISO 9001 is all about and how it works from both an implementation and an audit perspective. Now, the 2015 version of ISO 9001 was the first version of ISO 9001 that had an explanatory appendix. This is Appendix A or Annex A. Now, shortly after it was published, it became one of the only ISO standards to have a separate supplemental standard for explanatory purposes. And I've got some information on that coming on the next slide here. I'm referring to the technical specification 9002 or ISO 9002. Now, this document was published on November 1st of 2016, a little more than a year after 9001 was published. Now, its title is Quality Management Systems Guidelines for the Application of ISO 9001 2015. Now, this is an officially sanctioned guidance document, and it provides clause-by-clause ideas on fulfilling the requirements. Now, if you are familiar with the older version of ISO 9004, the one that goes back to 2000, this is a very similar publication to that in terms of its intent. So with all of this guidance, it's very easy to conclude that ISO 9001 is therefore an interpretive document. And because it is an interpretive document, it's not a stretch, again, to say that there is no perfect method for implementing any of the requirements. There is no particular expectation on how one requirement is supposed to be implemented versus another. The talking point is always that it's up to the organization to determine a methodology for implementation of the requirements. Now, the auditor's role in this process is to review what's been implemented and make a judgment call as to whether or not what's been implemented represents a true fulfillment of the requirement. Now, one of the more interesting changes that was brought about by the 2015 revision of ISO 9001 was the elimination of the procedure requirements. Now, if we've got anyone on the call here that remembers the 87 or 94 versions of ISO 9001, there were actually 16 required procedures in those versions. When we got to the 2000 version and the 2008 update, that number was trimmed to 6. Now, under the 2015 revision, there are no required procedures. Now, procedures are still very much a part of the picture for the average organization. But what you have to understand is if you choose to have a procedure for one activity or another, whatever it happens to be, the content of that procedure is going to be potentially brought to bear in an audit. So in other words, if you say you're going to do something in one of your procedures, well, you have to do it. You have to abide by whatever you have agreed to. So, and that's based on the definition for audit criteria. Now, this is a definition that comes in a couple of places. I'm quoting it from ISO 9000 in this context. Audit criteria is defined as a set of policies, procedures, or requirements that are used as reference against which the objective evidence is compared. So it's a very broad statement, and it's meant to be inclusive. There's a lot of things that can be brought to bear as audit criteria. Now, at this point, ISO 9001 2015, I see I have a typo here. It's actually been in print now for 9 years. It was published in September of 2015, so it's actually 9 years that it's been around. And ISO 9001 itself has been around for over 30 years at this point. Now, despite that tenure, it's interesting. A lot of the same things keep getting cited in ISO 9001 audits year after year, and in some cases for companies that have been certified for 20 years that presumably should know better. Now, in terms of how this was pulled together, when we wrote this presentation back in 2018, I performed a data mining exercise. I pulled about 350 audits looking at a 12-month period. And I did basically a review to confirm where the nonconformances were being written. Now, since 2018, I have continued to go back and kept tabs, so to speak, on what's getting written up. And these top 5 items are consistent. These are the items that continue to be cited over and over again, year after year, in the ISO 9001 audits. And these are actually provided in order of frequency. So the number one thing that gets cited is the content of the management review meeting. Number 2, failings within the internal audit process. Number 3, failings in terms of quality objectives. Number 4, calibration or measurement resources. And number 5, supplier or external provider approvals. Now, 3 of these, calibration, internal audit, and management review, these are all requirements that have been part of 9001 since the first edition was published back in '87. So these are not, in most cases, new requirements. These are definitely legacy requirements. So again, recognizing that we cannot advocate specific methodologies for implementing a requirement from ISO 9001. What we figured we could do is try to provide some clarity on what these requirements are commonly interpreted to mean and how they are commonly fulfilled. Now, over the next several slides here, I want you folks to bear in mind that this is not an official PJR endorsement of approach. and it cannot be used as justification for any circumstance cited by an auditor within an official nonconformance. I'll be giving you guys some details on how to request an impartial resolution of a disputed nonconformance a little bit later in my presentation. So let's start with the most commonly cited item, management review. Now, management review, the primary section for the requirements is section 9.3. And 9.3 has 3 subclauses. I'm going to be referring to these as parts. Now, in the front end, it says that you're going to review your quality management system at planned intervals to ensure continuing suitability, adequacy, effectiveness, etc. Now, the key takeaway from this part of the requirement is this business about planned intervals. Excuse me. Now, this statement intends for you to have some manner of controlling the frequency and the content of the meetings. Now, in terms of what that frequency is or how you're controlling it, that is completely up to you. You know, we've seen things like internal schedules, procedural stipulations, automated reminders. These are all acceptable protocols. The key is you have to be able to demonstrate that these management review meetings are taking place at planned intervals. Now, in the second part of the requirement here, we have a long list of things that need to be discussed. Now, I'm not going to read this to you, but as you can see, it covers quite a bit of ground. We have results of audits, corrective actions, customer satisfaction, internal issues, external issues. It's a long list of things that need to be included. Now, the content items that we just looked at on the prior page, these are mandatory, but it is not mandatory that every item be included in every management review meeting. You know, some of our clients are inclined to take management review in small bites. You might decide that you want to have 1 or 2 topics per month. Some organizations tell themselves they want to kind of get it all done at once, get it over with, so to speak. That's fine too. But again, that is up to you. A lot of our clients like to use PowerPoint presentations or some other means of presenting content. A lot of organizations have a standardized agenda format to make sure that they don't miss anything. Now, those are both great tools, but neither one of them is mandatory. You just, again, you have to kind of figure out for yourself what is going to be ideal, what's going to be possible for you, what's going to best work for you in terms of making sure that you don't miss anything. Now, in part 3 of the requirement for management review, there's 2 key items here. It says that your management review needs to include decisions and actions for opportunities for improvement, the need for changes and changing resource needs, and also that you need to retain documented information as evidence of the results. Now, the key takeaways here, there's 2 of them. First of all, the management review is supposed to be productive. This is not just a churn of information. This is, we're making decisions and we're formulating actions that we're going to take. You might even say we're reaching conclusions, but it's not just a churn of information. Now, the other aspect of this is retaining documented information. That means you need to have records of management review. Your auditors need to be able to see evidence that the meetings took place and what your decisions were, what your conclusions were, etc. Let's move on to the second item, and that is internal audit. Now, the internal audit requirement is found in section 9.3. 9.3 is made up of 2 subclauses. Firstly, It talks about internal audits being done at planned intervals. That's key. To provide information on whether the quality management system, now that's also key, conforms with the organization's own requirements for its quality management system, as well as the requirements of this international standard. When they say this international standard, they're referring to ISO 9001. And also if the quality management system has been effectively implemented and maintained. So let's unpack these points here and just make sure that we understand what they're talking about. Again, we have the aspect of planned intervals. Internal audits have to be planned in the same way that management review meetings need to be planned. And again, the planning mechanism is for you to determine. We've seen calendar triggers, we've seen audit plans, database scheduling, and other approaches to showing that the internal audits are conducted at planned intervals. Just like management review, you're also allowed to conduct the internal audit in small bites if you're so inclined. So if you're of a mind that you want to do one process a month or do the whole thing at once, it does need to kind of be based on what's going on within your system. And certainly you don't want to ignore problematic processes that should be getting internal audited. But for the most part, you've got control over your own process and your own discretion in terms of what you're going to be auditing. Now, the inclusion of the requirements of this international standard implies that you're expected to ensure that the requirements from ISO 9001 are included in the internal audit process. And one key mistake that is made that I want to make sure I mention today, some organizations forget to audit the internal audit process itself. So yes, you are expected to audit the audit. It is one of your processes. Now, I also made a point of pointing out this business about that the audit needs to be performed against the quality management system. Bear in mind, ISO 9001 establishes that a quality management system is made up of processes. This is established in section 441, where it says that you need to determine the processes needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization. So it is reasonable to conclude that your internal audits need to be structured with respect to your processes. You need to be performing a process-based internal audit to the extent possible. It should not be an audit exclusively of the clauses of 9001. It should be a process-based audit. Now, in part two, I've highlighted a couple of additional key items. We talk about selection of auditors and conduct of audits to ensure objectivity and impartiality. There is a requirement that you need to respond to the results of the audit with correction and corrective action. You'll note that those two items are mentioned side by side. And again, we have a retained documented information statement establishing that the internal audit is yet another required record. So in the prior slide, you hopefully noticed that you are there is no specific language in ISO 9001 for internal auditor competency. Now, this is actually a question that I get probably on a monthly basis. I'll have a client reach out to me and say, hey, what are we supposed to do to train our internal auditors? And my standard response for that is whatever you think is appropriate, because you must understand that the internal auditing is a competency. It's a competency just like any other competency, excuse me, within your organization. In other words, it's up to you to determine what it means to be qualified and competent to perform any task, and that includes internal auditing. So now that might mean that you're sending people to auditor school. It might mean that you are enrolling them in an online class. It might mean that you are training them yourselves using materials that you've developed internally. Whatever you put in place, our team is going to look at it and make sure that it's effective. We're going to verify that by the adequacy of the internal audit itself. Now, this is not just a training sign-off. There does need to be some substance behind what is going on, that we're making sure the auditors are qualified and competent. Now, another issue that comes up from time to time, and it's in the language we looked at from the standard, is a lack of responsiveness to internal audit nonconformances. Now, bear in mind that an internal audit nonconformance by the book is supposed to be treated in exactly the same way as a customer complaint or a nonconformance issued by PJR. And that's why in the standard it mentions both correction and corrective action. The expectation is that you are doing both of those items for any internal audit nonconformance. Excuse me, I'm a little parched at the moment here. And again, we have a documented information requirement establishing that internal audit records need to be retained. Now, this is another area where occasionally there are some mistakes that are made. Some organizations, they'll have the internal audit, everything goes well, and the only thing that they keep are the nonconformances that are written. Now, you might think that the internal audit nonconformances are the only things worth keeping, but you need to be prepared to show evidence of that the internal audit was in fact performed, that the auditors were out there interviewing people, gathering evidence, etc. Now, as to what form those documents are going to take, again, completely up to you, whether you're using checklists or procedural printouts or special database protocols for recording the internal audit, completely at your own discretion. Now, a point that I want to make has to do with consultants. We have a lot of clients that choose to outsource their internal audit program to a consultant, and that is completely okay. But what you need to bear in mind is that regardless of whether or not you did your internal audit or your team did the internal audit, or you had a consultant do it for you, the responsibility for the internal audit program belongs to the organization and not to the consultant. You should still be prepared to speak confidently about your internal audit process and how it is controlled. This should be something that you are able to speak to just like any other process within your company. So let's move on, and we'll talk now about quality objectives. The quality objectives requirement is found in section 6.2. All right, again, I've highlighted a couple of key items from part 1 here, where it talks about that your quality objectives need to be measurable. They need to be relevant to product conformity and to the enhancement of customer satisfaction, and they need to be monitored, communicated, and updated as appropriate. Now, let's start with this business of the quality objectives have to be measurable. The logic here, the idea here is that without measurability, there's really no reliable way to know if the objective was met or not. Now, the intent here, I should say, the most common way of meeting this is with variable measurement type objectives. In other words, something like on-time delivery or measures of customer satisfaction. But we will accept attribute type objectives as well. In other words, a pass-fail type item. We've seen organizations that have used either or both of those approaches. Now, the language also talks about relevancy to customer satisfaction and products and services. Now, this was actually new language when the 2015 revision of ISO 9001 was published. You should note that if you have objectives that are rooted in things like profitability, safety, etc., that's fine. But those are not going to reflect on customer satisfaction or product service conformity in a direct fashion. So if you do have objectives for things like profitability, safety, etc., you just need to be prepared to have other objectives, additional objectives that reflect on the customer satisfaction and conformance of products and services. Now, quality objectives are a topic in a similar vein to quality policy. This is something that everyone in the quality management system, everyone in the building, needs to be prepared to demonstrate some knowledge and awareness. Now, in my personal case, I always ask the question the same way. Are you familiar with the quality objectives? And can you explain what they mean to me? I don't expect people to have them memorized. That's never been the intent. But I do expect them to be something that, oh, right, that's something that we talked about 2 weeks ago, or my manager came around and mentioned it to me. Now, you can do this however it works for you. Placards, meetings, putting it by the time clock, whatever works. But you do need to get the word out on those quality objectives. Now, in part 2, it talks about you need to determine what will be done and what resources you'll need, who's responsible, when it's going to be completed. It's kind of a succinct restating of what's in part 1. Now, in 9002, there's some clarity on what they mean by when they say what will be done. This is determining the actions that need to be implemented to achieve your quality objectives. So in other words, it's not enough to just have the objectives. You do need to be actively working towards the achievement of those objectives. Now, the key overall takeaway, again, is it's not enough to just have them. You have to track progress achieved towards them. And if you're not achieving the objectives, you need to be taking some form of appropriate action to improve the objectives' performance. Now, what that means, it means an appropriate response. It doesn't mean formal corrective action necessarily, but you need to be, firstly, aware that the objectives are not being met, and you need to have your arms around what are we doing about it. Let's move on to monitoring and measuring resources. Now, this requirement for most folks is referred to as calibration. I still, on audits, I'll have people say, are you ready to look at our calibration records? So monitoring and measuring resources, this is going to refer to any device or gauge or what have you that's used to perform monitoring and measurement of outputs. Now, this is most typically referred to as inspection or testing. That's the most common lingo that's used for this activity. Now, the primary clause from ISO 9001 that is in play for this calibration activity is section 7.1.5, which has 2 subclauses. In the beginning part, it talks about determining and providing the resources needed for valid and reliable results, and ensuring that those resources are suitable, that the resources are maintained. And then there's a statement about retaining appropriate evidence, documented evidence, as evidence of fitness for purpose of the monitoring and measurement resources. In other words, you need to have records that are demonstrating that these devices are sufficient. And again, this is records, and this time it's records of calibration or verification for all of your measurement devices. Now, as to the content of said records, for that we need to actually refer to the second part of the calibration requirement. Okay, so in this second part, again, there's a lot of verbiage here, but there's specific things that kind of stand out. Your measurement equipment needs to be calibrated or verified. Now, those are two different things, but they accomplish the same output. At specified intervals, the calibration or verification needs to take place, or prior to use, against measurement standards that are traceable to international or national measurement standards. That's key. And then also, they need to be, the measurement devices need to be identified in order to determine their status. So those are kind of the two key items here. These are the two most oft violated aspects of the requirement. First of all, this business about traceability to national or international standards. Now, here in the United States, this is most typically going to be the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Now, NIST has got ways of tracing measurement accuracy into the, well, very accurate. I mean, decimal points in the dozens. Let's call it that. But there are occasionally measurement types for which there is not a NIST traceable method. This is rare. But in that situation, what you're allowed to do is have calibration be performed by the device manufacturer. That is kind of the alternative if we don't have a NIST traceable method. Now, I also want to address this business of identification in order to determine status. It is occasionally misunderstood that this means calibration stickers. It actually doesn't specifically mean calibration stickers. The verbiage says identification in order to determine status. Now, as long as there is some form of device identification that permits traceability to the calibration record, that is considered acceptable. And by the way, if you have a device that is not subject to calibration, it needs to be labeled for that as well. That is absolutely a requirement. Let's round out our top 5 items with external provider approvals. Now, in the older versions of ISO 9001, some of the terminology that was used was suppliers, subcontractors, outside partners. Now, the requirements associated with those parties were in separate parts of the standard. Now, in the 2015 revision, those people were all brought together under the collective term external provider, and the requirements to approve those parties were put together in section 8.4.1. Now, these ideas are not new, but the 2015 revision kind of brought them all together in one space. Now, in 8.4.1, it says that you need to determine and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring, and reevaluation of external providers based on their ability to provide processes, products, and services in accordance with your requirements. And you shall retain documented information of those activities and necessary actions arising from the evaluations. So, first of all, it is required that you figure out how you're going to evaluate these external providers. Now, again, this is at your discretion. Whatever is appropriate, whatever meets your needs in terms of evaluation and approval is for you to determine. Now, what that is and how you implement it is up to you. It's also key to note that the requirement calls out monitoring and reevaluation, and also that it talks about retaining records of these activities. So, to be very blunt about it, to have the external provider's name on a list is not sufficient evidence of evaluation on its own, because this is not a record of the evaluation activity. It tells me that they were evaluated, but it doesn't represent a record of the evaluation activity. And again, that's a key distinction. Okay, so moving on, I want to mention now in this part of my presentation, 2 additional requirements that were new at the time that the 2015 revision came out. And these were kind of the new requirements that people were kind of nervous about at the time. The first of these was risk and then interested parties. Now, risk and risk-based thinking, the term risk is used 16 times in the auditable portion of ISO 9001. Now, identification of risk, management of risk, it's viewed as a system-wide strategy, much the same way that continual improvement was when the ISO 9001 2000 version was published. Now, one of the things that they went to some lengths to emphasize was that risk management, a formal risk management process, is not specifically required. The intent is that you're going to apply risk aversion to all of the various areas of your quality management system. ISO 9001, or excuse me, ISO 9002 talks about key risks that would include things like the failure of your processes, or the failure of products, or the failure of services to meet requirements, or overall not achieving customer satisfaction as a key risk. Now, risk is found primarily in section 6.1. In the first part, it talks about when you're planning for the quality management system, you need to consider the issues that are referred to in section 4.1, meaning those that come from inside and outside your organization, and the requirements that are referred to in 4.2, meaning those that come from internal and external interested parties. And from those issues, determine the risks and opportunities, and that those are 2 halves of the same coin. Risks are going to be viewed in a light of reducing or preventing undesired effects. Opportunities are going to be viewed as enhancing desirable effects. And overall, this effort is going to give assurance that you can achieve your intended result through your quality management system and achieve improvement. Now, in section 6.1.2, it talks about, based on this analysis, planning your actions to address the risks and opportunities, and then integrating and implementing those actions into your quality management system. So again, this is not a formal risk management process. This is integrating these risk actions into the processes you already have. So what do they mean by actions to address risks and opportunities? Well, again, we can refer to ISO 9002 for some further guidance. We might think about risk avoidance, just stopping whatever the process in question is, or the step in the process. Risk limitation. This might be addressed by things like establishing procedures or work instructions to reduce the risk. Could be risk sharing. Good example of this might be bulk purchasing of raw materials with customer approval and buy-in, so to speak. Could be risk transfer, things like maintaining insurance or other similar arrangements. And finally, it could be risk acceptance. Basically, when you've implemented the reasonable measures, having a final acceptance that the remaining risk is indeed acceptable. So how do we audit risk? How have we approached the audit of this activity? Well, we have directed our team, our auditors, to ask about risk management and to be prepared to examine the various activities that are presented. So in other words, when our client says, here is what we have done to meet this requirement, well, let's take a look at it. Let's consider the merits of this approach and how this works as a fulfillment of the requirement. Now, one thing that we expect is we expect you to understand the concept, and you need to be prepared to explain to us what you've done. You need to be able to speak confidently on it. Say, here is how my process meets this requirement from ISO 9001. And again, I promise you, our auditors are going to approach this with an open mind. Also, in terms of risk actions, the key place where these are mentioned as far as records are concerned is tied in with management review. In 932E, it says that the effectiveness of actions to address risks and opportunities needs to be included in the management review meeting. And of course, 933 says that you need to have records of management review. So bear that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about the concept of interested parties. Now, this is a defined item. It's actually defined in section Annex A, I want to say it's A3 of ISO 9001, where it establishes that an interested party is a person or organization that can be affected by or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. Now, the examples that are given in ISO 9001 itself include customers, owners, the employees of the organization, suppliers, bankers, and some others. Now, in section 4.2, it indicates that the organization needs to determine who their interested parties are. But it emphasizes these need to be interested parties that are relevant to the quality management system. So again, the idea is you need to make sure that your quality management system is considering the relevant input requirements. Now, this term, interested party, the idea was that this was meant to kind of broaden the scope of who you might think of. Obviously, being cognizant of applicable requirements, that's just good business. Now, one point that we have had to emphasize here, in most situations, it's going to be inappropriate for an organization to conclude that their only interested party group is their customer base. So what we've trained our auditors to do with this is if we have an organization that says, well, it's just our customers, they're the only ones that are an interested party. Well, we'll say, okay, but how did you come to that conclusion? What analysis did you do to reach that conclusion? Now, if we don't see evidence of an analysis, we may have to issue a nonconformance, but we will consider the possibility at face value. So in terms of who else might be an interested party, ISO 9002 has an even longer list than what appears in ISO 9001. Now, here it talks about local community groups, neighboring organizations, competitors, the statutory and regulatory requirements, or authorities rather, trade groups, and so forth. Now, how does an organization figure out what their interested parties want? Well, again, 9002 provides some guidance, and I'd be willing to bet that most of you on our call today are doing at least some of the items from this list. So things like reviewing orders that you're getting from customers, reviewing statutory regulatory requirements, going to networking sessions, conducting market surveillance, conducting customer surveys, and so forth. These are all possibilities in terms of determining what the interested parties are wanting from you and kind of flowing that into your system. Now, what nonconformances are most likely as it relates to interested parties? Well, there's two clauses that are most relevant in this situation. First of all, section 4.2. If we cannot conclude that you have monitored and reviewed information from interested parties, that could potentially be cited under section 4.2. Also, if we are not seeing evidence of interested party feedback being discussed within management review, that could be cited against 9.3.2 subclause C1. Let's talk about one more item from ISO 9001, and that is section 5.1, where we find some exacting and crucial requirements that pertain to leadership. Now, what we've done with this requirement, and I recently found out that PJR is the only certification body that has approached it in this fashion. We have created an event that we call the leadership interview, where we have our auditors have the leadership join them. This is usually right after the opening meeting to go over a set of targeted questions that are going to address some of these leadership concepts. So what I've got on screen right now are the actual leadership interview questions. What are you specifically doing to be accountable for the effectiveness of your system? How do you participate in your system? Who are your interested parties? Do you have a process to monitor interested party requirements? And what are some current internal and external issues that you are attempting to address within your organization? Now, these are all things that the leadership of the organization should be able to speak to confidently and cohesively. There should be a shared focus and having everyone be on the same page with these items. Now, in some cases, when we get the completed audit report, we note that only a single individual was included in the leadership interview. Now, that is conceivable in a small operation, a small company, but the bigger the company gets, the more sense it makes that there is an actual team of people that are running not just the quality management system, but the company at large. Now, in terms of what they mean by leadership, 9002 actually has some guidance on what this means. It talks about certain authorities and responsibilities can be delegated, but the accountability remains with top management. So we may have some people on our call today who remember when we had a position called the management representative within ISO 9001. Now that is still very much something that exists as a concept, but the intent is that management does not wash its hands of the quality management system. Management is very much involved and responsible. So what happens if we don't agree? What happens if a nonconformance is written and the auditee and the auditor just don't agree on the merits of it? Well, we are required to provide a process for an impartial review of contested nonconformances. Now, there is a procedure for this even. It's called Pro 10, PJR's procedure Pro 10. And it's available for download. If you go to our website, at the bottom of the homepage, you'll find a link entitled Registration Document Download. You can download a copy of Pro 10 for yourself. Now, any dispute needs to be received within 15 calendar days of the end of the audit. Now, we do have a separate webinar that includes coverage of the disputes process. If you want to check out the webinar, Your Ongoing Relationship with PJR, it includes discussion of the disputes process. In conclusion, ISO 9001 is still the world's most utilized standard. There are just over 900,000 registered companies worldwide. And as I mentioned, many of the items that are cited in nonconformances are entirely avoidable, and they seem to come up time and time again. We do hope that the content of our presentation today will leave you feeling more confident that things are going to go well on audit day. If you're ready for a deeper dive into ISO 9001, we do have a clause-by-clause course. It's available on our website. It is 100% free. So if you go under the training link, you will find where you can register for that. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We do have a presentation on non-applicable clauses. and what can be and what cannot be excluded in an audit assessment. We also have a very popular presentation called The Interaction of Processes and its Importance to a Successful Audit. This is a deep dive into the concept of processes and how to correctly understand them. And we have presentations on a wide variety of other topics: corrective action, stage 1 auditing, disputes, as I mentioned, and so forth. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the very best way for you to do that is to visit our website at www.pjr.com. Go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address in the provided space, and click subscribe. You will be opted in for automatic updates on changes to the standard, upcoming webinars, and other helpful points of information. I do thank you for your time. As a reminder, this presentation, the slides will be available for download shortly after we're finished, and if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with colleagues, we will be posting it to our YouTube channel. It should be available sometime this afternoon or early tomorrow. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard and see if we have questions today. Natalie Hoy asks, what is the difference between quality objectives and quality policy? That's a great question. The quality policy statement, Natalie, it's a statement that is developed by the leadership of the organization that represents the organization's overall commitment to quality, commitment to a successful quality management system, and commitment to continual improvement. It is a high-level statement. Quality objectives, on the other hand, are measurable goals that have been established for the quality management system. Now, the intent is that these two items should be in line with each other. They should not be seeking different things. But in most cases, in fact, all the cases I've ever seen, where an organization has implemented both successfully, they are always aligned with each other. So I hope that answers your question. Are there any other questions I can answer today? Okay, very good. Wishing all of you a great day, and thank you so much for your attention.